Hello, my name is Marion. I'm a third-year English and history student who has been passionately interested in history since I was about 12, and I picked up a historical fiction novel on Elizabeth I. I had run out of books to read, something that happened quite a lot, and I just came across it. And, well, I became interested in the Tudors, and that expanded into most of the English history timeline. I had been reading pretty much non-stop since I was about 8 years old. And it wasn't until my teens that I realized that the history behind fiction was often as interesting as the fiction itself. As a result, I decided to combine both my interests in history and literature into my university degree. I made this channel to hopefully give you an interesting perspective on literature and the history behind it, and to introduce you to works that perhaps you wouldn't have found on your own. This will be a 6-part series. The first video, I will look into the history of the Restoration period, while with the others I'll look into the authors that the Restoration period produced. I'll be looking at Aphra Behn, who's arguably the first novel writer in the English language. Later I'll be looking at William Wycherley, whose play, The Country Wife, is one of the funniest things I've read outside of Wilde. There's also John Dryden, who was the first poet laureate, and Margaret Cavendish, who published what is arguably the first science fiction novel, centuries before Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And of course, my personal favorite, John Wilmot, Earl of Rochester, whose collection of poetry is extensive and very interesting. The Restoration period is technically just a few months in 1660 and 1661, during which King Charles II returned to the throne of England. But Restoration literature often refers to works produced between 1660 and 1714, which covers the second half of the Stuart monarchy. For simplicity's sake, I will be referring to works produced between the year 1660 and 1714. Let's look at the monarchs of the time. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth I, the last of the Tudor dynasty, died, and the Stuarts were called down from Scotland to come and rule both the Scottish and English throne from London, which, as you know, the Scots were absolutely thrilled about. King James I of England took the English throne and later handed it to his son Charles I. Charles was an absolutist monarch. He did not want to have Parliament interrupt his ruling. However, the English system had for centuries limited the power of kings, and Parliament played a large role in that. This caused some minor issues that resulted in his beheading. Kings did have quite a lot of power, but taxes, which were the main way in which kings could fund their war campaigns and their own courts, was mostly controlled by Parliament. As we all know, money is power, and without money, what's the point of having a crown? So Charles spent quite a lot of time trying to convince Parliament to give him more and more money. This didn't quite work out, and in the end, he dismissed Parliament in anger and decided to rule on his own. This personal rule, or 11-year tyranny, as it is sometimes called, infuriated his people. And Charles also made another grave mistake. He married a Catholic woman. King Henry VIII, of Six Wives fame, had prevented the Catholic Church from continuing its hold in England by destroying the monasteries and by beheading a lot of people. Eliminating Catholicism from England did hurt quite a few people, but it was nothing compared to the anger that resulted when his daughter, Mary I, married a Spanish Catholic and burned a few Protestants at the stake. As a result, most people united against the Catholics, or the Papists, as they were called. Elizabeth I was much more tolerant, but England was clearly a Protestant nation upon her rule. Scotland had always had a different view on religion from the English, and when Charles and his advisor, Bishop Laud, tried to install a system in Scotland that was similar to that in England, riots broke out, and the Scots rose up and invaded England. Now this was a problem, because this was during the last few years of this 11-year tyranny, and Charles did not have any money with which he could fight the Scots. Most of the taxes that he had been able to collect were not enough to fund an army, and the ones that he needed, Parliament still controlled, but Parliament had not been in session for 11 years, and as you can imagine, the rich and noble families that ran Parliament were extremely thrilled about that. In desperation, Charles called Parliament back. Before Parliament would cash out, they insisted that Charles agree to certain terms. Now, unfortunately, this only infuriated Charles, and he ended Parliament. That's why it's called the Short Parliament. Later, he called what was later known to be the Long Parliament, but as Charles continued to disagree with it, a civil war broke out. Parliamentarians versus Royalists fought on several different battlefields. The war ended at the Battle of Worcester in 1651, with the parliamentarians winning and the king being taken away into prison. He was later beheaded. His son, Charles II, as he would later be known, had witnessed several of the battles and had fought beside his father, but when it was clear that they were losing the war, he had been sent off to France to join his mother and other family abroad in the safety of French courts. On the continent, there was little for him to do other than just enjoy court life and to moan about not being king. There was really nothing to be done. Popular opinion in England was still against the monarchy, and they were welcoming Cromwell and his parliament. Thomas Cromwell ruled a Puritan parliament in England for several years, and among other things he banned Christmas, theatre, music, and maypoles. When he died, it became quite clear that public opinion had turned once again towards the monarchy, and Charles II was pretty much just invited back. In 1660, Charles II was restored to his father's throne, hence the Restoration. Now, Charles could have come back and beheaded everyone who had been involved in his own father's death, but he realized that that would be slightly problematic, as there would be a lot of people he would have to kill. So instead, he decided to create the Act of Indemnity and Oblivion, which persecuted only the people who had actually physically signed his father's death warrant. And only 9 people were killed under the act. Others were imprisoned for life or just imprisoned for a short period of time. Some notable events that happened during Charles's reign include one of the last great plagues, the 1666 fire of London, a few Dutch wars that ended with England gaining control of the entire Hudson's Bay area and giving it to the Hudson's Bay Company, and of course Charles's Treaty of Dover, which he made with the French king, and in which he secretly converted it to Catholicism and gained quite a large allowance from the French in order to supply his own coffers. Of course, the Treaty of Dover was kept secret, as during this period Popish plots were being suspected and people were actually being executed for being suspected of being Catholic spies. There is a modern parallel with today's society in which we are mostly convinced that all Muslims are terrorists. This is clearly not true, but just like in the 1600s, where people were paranoid that all Catholics were evil spies, we have fallen into the same trap again. History does repeat itself. The Popish plots caused so much fear and agitation that people are even demanding that James, Charles's brother, step down from being the next heir to the throne, because he was a Catholic. By late 1681, the paranoia had subsided a bit, and Parliament decided that yes, James would be the heir to Charles's throne if Charles died childless, which he did not long after. King James II of England came to the throne with his Catholic wife, Mary of Modena. He had had a previous marriage, and by that marriage 2 adult children, Anne and Mary, who were both married and abroad. So when Mary of Modena got pregnant with a child, everything would have been fine had it been a girl. It would have been a Catholic child, and third in line for the throne. Surely Mary and Anne would have children to displace the Catholic child. But no, James had a little boy. The boy would have been brought up a Catholic, and that was intolerable to the English Parliament, who decided that they could tolerate a few years of James II being ruler, as long as the heirs would be Protestant. But a Catholic heir meant that there was a good chance a new Catholic dynasty would be installed on the throne of England, and that was a big no-no. This is what sparked the 1688 Glorious Revolution that saw James II and his wife and child kicked out of England to the continent, and his daughter Mary being installed on the throne of England with her husband William of Orange. This was technically a Dutch invasion, but one that every Protestant quite happily welcomed. Mary and William gave up quite a few of their rights upon reaching the English throne. They were given the crowns only with a few provisions being added by government. The Catholic Stuart line would continue to live on the continent for a few generations, occasionally launching an invasion of England in order to regain their rightful throne, such as the invasion that Bonnie Prince Charlie attempted through Scotland. None of them were successful, and the Protestant line remained on the throne. Mary and William would rule England together until William's death in 1702, quite a few years after Mary's own death, and then Queen Anne came to the throne, but she died in 1714, and that is when the Hanover dynasty began, when they invited George I over from Germany to become king. The years after the Glorious Revolution were filled with technological advancements such as the solving of the longitude problem, which you'll think longitude is simple. No, they had a lot of trouble figuring it out. Advancements in clock technology, and the union of the English and Scottish crowns, which has totally not caused any issues at all in the last 300 years. During Anne's reign, the Spanish Wars of Succession took place, and this allowed England to gain control of a lot of New England's territory. As successful as this era was, it is no surprise that arts and literature also thrived, as women as well as men published works and pieces of art. This was the beginning of the poet laureates, and the beginning of novels as we know them today. The writers I have chosen to talk about are by no means the only writers of the era. However, they are important figures in literature history, and they have contributed greatly to our modern understanding of literature.